Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor. I was telling some friends in India that it's one thing to do these kinds of conferences and interventions in certain parts of the world, like the Western part of the world, and it's a totally other thing done in a context not only like that of India, but also specifically of the Asian College of Journalism. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored. Um, I think I have only about 20 minutes left for this session, and my plan was basically to maybe try and walk you through the ties the ties between Palestinian and Egyptian history, which the historical ties between both histories, which can help us understand Egypt's role in the conflict today, and particularly on the siege of Gaza. And as usual, history can always be narrated from different standpoints, but it's important to put that in mind and to also see where the different intersections between the different narratives of history lie. So I would like to quickly point to certain moments in the classical imperial lens to understanding the story of Egypt next to Palestine, and then flip that and look at the grassroots entry point to that combined history of Egypt and Palestine. And when we talk about the imperial slash colonial history of both Palestine and Egypt, the one question that I like to always ask in order to sort of position this conflict to where it really belongs is, what does it mean to be on the losing side of the world's imperial history at a certain moment in time, i.e., what does it mean to be part of the Ottoman Empire when the Ottoman Empire is losing? What it basically means is such things as imperial powers like France and the UK getting together and signing some secret agreements, such as the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement that was signed in 1916, which basically led the way to dividing control over the Eastern Arab region between France and the UK. And so it happened that Egypt and Palestine fell under the same bucket of control back then, i.e. UK control, okay? So what does it mean to be on the losing side of the world's imperial history at this point in time? It means that Palestine falls under the British mandate in 1920, and Egypt also continues to be part of the British Empire since 1882 in different ways until we granted independence. And I cite these not only because it's an important situating history. Imperial history is an important entry point to understanding the war that we're witnessing right now. And it's also not only an imperial history that we narrate; it's actually the very history that is being conjured by Israel nowadays. In other words, if some of you, and it was mentioned in the previous panel, have sat through the Israeli Defense Team's response at the International Court of Justice on Friday, that very imperial history was put in place to remind of where this conflict stands. So the British mandate was mentioned, the Balfour Declaration was mentioned by the Israeli legal team. So it is a story of imperial history. Now back to Egypt and Israel, Egypt and Palestine. So basically, in the face of this imperial history, naturally, this imperialism is not just happening on an empty ground where, there's no agency, there is no popular liberation movement. To the contrary, there are strong liberation movements building up in both countries at this point in time. And in Egypt, it so happens that it's a liberation movement that is able to form and to coalesce. And, you can think of it as perhaps the equivalent of the Congress Party in India or the Sinn Féin in Ireland. In the case of Palestine, the liberation movement happens to be far more challenged in terms of its organization and its ability to coalesce, primarily because you have an important contingent that Egypt doesn't have, which is massive Jewish migration, organized migration with massive support, again, from the imperial powers. So you have the contingency of not just the classical imperial power, but a nascent community that is trying to establish itself as the state in lieu of the Palestinian communities. So basically, what we have is a universalist imperial order, a universalist imperial history, and the particular contingent of liberation, which coming together, they take us to two different places when it comes to the two countries. In the case of Palestine, in 1948, we have the declaration of the State of Israel, again, product of organized migration, armed Israeli actions throughout this period, and then strong imperial support. And in 1952, you have the declaration of the Republic of Egypt under Nasserism. So here, the two histories continue to be strongly connected, on the grounds of facing off with imperialism. There is a certain oneness in the struggle. Egyptian fighters fight alongside Palestinian fighters in resisting the declaration of the State of Israel in the 1948 war. But also the resistance, the one resistance continues over the ensuing years, which happened to be called the Arab-Israeli Wars. Egypt fights on behalf of Palestine and on behalf of the Arab nation. Of course, there is nuance in this, in the sense that on one hand, Nasser fights on behalf of Palestine, but also was very much an idea of his own project of controlling the Arab nation. And, as he says in one of his diaries, we were fighting for Palestine, but our dream was Egypt. That's in reference to 1967. So without going through a long history lesson here, it's important to note that this is the end of the Arab wars, of the Arab-Israeli wars, marked the beginning of a certain bifurcation, basically between Egypt and Palestine. And when I talk about bifurcation, I'm not putting an end to imperialism. We are very much living in the remnants of the imperialist order, but basically experienced in different ways, experienced in this very bifurcation that happens between the fates of both countries. With that silent, let's call it silent imperialism, this bifurcation happens with the peace accords that Egypt signs in 1979 with Israel. I'll stay in Egypt for a bit here, and I'll try to point to how this moment was very crucial in the contemporary political transformation of Egypt. The peace accords basically transform the military institution in Egypt, which is the most powerful political institution in this country. In fact, it is the institution that declared the country's independence back in the 1950s. But following the peace accords, it becomes an institution with a different political project. its main task becomes safeguarding peace in the region and making sure no more Arab-Israeli wars take place. B, it sits on the margins of domestic politics. It's no longer part of the creation of the new post-colonial state. It's just sitting on the margins of politics. And C, it is becoming an economic empire in its own respect, also thanks to a lot of support from the United States, which vested interest is obviously to support the peace accords, the Camp David peace accords. So basically, we have an institution that is sitting on the margins of politics, making sure there's no more resistance to Israel. In fact, making sure there is more and more normalization with Israel, and at the same time, it's also building its own economic wealth. So it's a complete transformation in the 1950s and 1960s post-colonial liberation, anti-colonial liberation moment that we were narrating a moment ago, and that was connecting Palestine to Egypt. And in tandem with this project, was this new military institution project, you have a new political moment that is, best represented by the Mubarak regime in the early 1980s and throughout the last 3 decades, a new political project that is centered on, an Egyptian national identity, Egyptian versus Arab. In order for Egypt to do well, to economically prosper, it cannot keep fighting wars that are not its wars. It needs to normalize relations with Israel, because that also means a lot of economic gains and economic prosperity, not just out of the ties with Israel, but also out of the general ties with the Western world. So these are all important transformations on the very level of a national identity that is setting Egypt more and more apart from Palestine. This is the bifurcation that we're talking about here. But all what I narrated right now is a story from above, right? Is the imperial and post-colonial way of narrating these 50 years of history. A flip side of it, in which I'd like to situate myself, is a popular history of Egypt and Palestine. So basically, Egyptian freedom fighters, independent freedom fighters, were fighting by the side of Palestinians in 1948. When Abdel Nasser came over in 1952 with a new liberation project, there was massive popular support to this project. There was a massive rallying around the idea of there being an Arab identity coming together and coalescing in the face of imperialism. And also the several defeats of Arab armies, including Egyptian armies, in the Arab-Israeli wars, most notably the 1967 war, was lived as a massive popular defeat for the people, and most notably dissidents and intellectuals and writers. We've had cases of writers falling into not just crippling depressions, but actually committing suicide and feeling that there is nothing more left. This is how these moments were lived on a popular level in the 1970s, in the early 1970s and late 1960s. A nation students movement, what would be the reference student movement, because I'm speaking at a university now, its main coalescing and forming was around the need to pressure the government to fight back with Israel after the 1967 defeat. And that movement was foundational to the student movement across the board in Egypt. So if we're talking about a peace agreement signed with Israel in the 1970s, that's really statist peace at the state level. But the public sentiment always remained to be pro-Palestine. There was never a normalization project on the level of the people. And this is basically the history that I like to situate myself in. I started doing journalism in Egypt in the early 2000s. I was learning. I was a student at the university at the time, and it was also at the same time the moment where the Second Palestinian Intifada, one of many chapters of continuing Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation. So, the protests that are supporting the Palestinian cause during the Second Intifada were animating my university life and my first years of journalism. They made me want to do journalism, actually. They situated my interest in journalism as a political endeavor, basically. And these protests and this moment and the Palestinian cause overall became the political compass for my generation of people, journalists, writers, intellectuals, artists, who want to situate themselves politically in general, with regards to Egypt in particular, all through that compass of the Palestinian cause as, a continuing anti-imperial cause that we have to keep our eyes on, and to basically avoid that bifurcation, that it's no longer a connected history. And this is what we're living today. If we're fast forwarding to the moment we're living today, we've been covering the war on Gaza since October of last year. We normally cover Gaza because it's not just the part of that political compass that I was talking about, but also the Gaza Strip borders Egypt. Egypt is the only Arab state that has a shared border with the Gaza Strip, which puts Egypt in an important position, not just in this war, but in the lead up for it. So ever since Hamas took over in 2007, Egypt basically entered into a tacit agreement with the Israelis to engage in a border management where the siege on the Strip is also co-sponsored by Egypt, basically. And that is part of, that post-peace agreement that I mentioned earlier in the talk. So, part of Egypt's responsibility and commitment to manage peace with Israel is to basically manage the Gaza Strip by supporting Israel policy of the siege on it. My newspaper did a long series on how the siege has manifested over the years on the Gaza Strip. So it's the kind of siege where, we're talking about, and you probably read about this in many other places, but we're talking about a situation where, food is entered through very tight calculations of how many calories should be, what is the bare minimum of calories that, should enter into Gaza to preserve people from just massive famine. Fuel the same, entry of people and exit of people the same. And, if we are to agree that the siege of Gaza is a main propeller of this war, then definitely there is a role that's been played by Egypt in preserving this status quo of the siege. And it so happens that also this siege was preserved during this ongoing war that is approaching the 100 days mark in a few days. in the sense that Egypt could not at least support in passing on humanitarian assistance, enough humanitarian assistance to the border throughout this war because of Israeli intransigence. Egypt plans to actually present documentation to this effect at the ICJ because, again, the Israeli legal representatives at the ICJ claimed that it has nothing to do with the border, the Egyptian Gaza border, and it's Egypt's responsibility, the lack of humanitarian assistance, which is something that Egypt protests. It's hard to think of it as something else than again this dialectical tension between the remnant of imperialism, of Egypt not being able to manage its own borders on its own, but also Egypt's own interest in aiding that siege on Gaza. On the ground, again, to go back to the popular dimension of this crisis, people are talking. There is a comeback of the Palestinian question in our streets in ways that has been absented in the past years, again, under the same rhetoric that Egypt has its own problems, has its own crisis. Palestine is an other to us. This has been completely dismantled with the Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip, with rising pro-Palestine sentiments all throughout, while we are not really able to express them in the streets because of the limited political space that's allowed to us in terms of public expression of politics. That again, like I said, brings us to these two layers. Looking at the crisis from above and looking at it from a popular level, and also seeing how imperial remnants continue to mediate this ongoing conflict, while as a nation state we are situated in it differently nowadays. I'm happy to take your questions, and I hope the presentation was more or less clear. It's hard to tell from the screen, but yeah, thank you very much.
We're now open to questions from the audience. Please ask one question at a time and let the mic reach you. Please speak clearly into the mic for the speaker to listen to you.
Thank you, ma'am. My name is Muhammad Mukhtar. I'm a student of ACJ. My question is that I heard that this claim that Hamas was made by Israel, and you know that it have a rich connection with Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So, and also Yasser Arafat was also once a member of Muslim Brotherhood, and I read that, and also this Muslim Brotherhood's branch was made in Gaza, and which was effectively later called as Hamas. And how true is this claim that Hamas was made by Israel to defeat Fatah?
I think it's very easy for certain historical narratives to form and shape to the favor of one of the fighting parties, but it's also very important for us to understand the complexity of history. Like, of course, Israel is a very powerful state and is capable of creating Hamas and many others. But is it possible to imagine that an entire resistance fighting movement is created by Israel and now is being in a situation where It's killing its own people. And when we make a claim like this, what kind of agency is there in such a narration to the people on the ground? Palestinians have been resisting Israeli occupation since before 1948, ever since migratory Jewish flows have entered Palestine with the aim of upholding the Zionist project of creating an Israeli state that absents Palestinians from the ground. And this resistance has come in different forms and ways. Far before actually the Muslim Brotherhood, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, where Yasser Arafat sat on top, was, primarily armed, shaped as a resistance movement in the face of this Zionist project. And this is what I talked about when I said that Palestine also had its liberation movement, like Egypt has had its own, like India had its own, like Ireland had its own, except that the challenges ahead of the Palestinian resistance movement was basically far more formidable than in any other place. So one can only understand the creation of Hamas in this continuum of resistance. Whether we agree with its ideological politics or not, it does continue to be situated in this history. Now, there has been a certain convenience for Israel in the existence of Hamas, in the sense that it created the setup in Gaza that would make it very, very hard for the Palestinian liberation to, be united in one front, and this is ideal for Israel. But to claim that Hamas is Israel's creation is to basically be reductionist, I would have to say, in understanding the history of Palestinian liberation, which, like I said, is a continuum that began far before 1948 and continues to exist today in this, very specific configuration of Islamic insurgent movement in the Strip. So I just wanted to clarify that it's reductionist to say it's an Israeli creation. It's convenient. It was convenient for Israel to have Hamas there in Gaza, control Gaza, fight off with Fatah, completely prevent the potentiality of a Palestinian unity that could be conducive to the creation of a Palestinian state. All of these are conveniences until the resistance goes back to its work as resistance, which is what we're seeing right now in this 100-day war.
Hello. Yeah. Good afternoon, ma'am. So since we are talking about the narration of history from the imperialistic point of view, one story, particularly in the case of Israel-Palestine, the role of Egypt was 1977-78, Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, and Israel signing peace accord, recognizing Egypt recognizing Israel. And 3 years later, the president was assassinated. It is said that he was on the targets of extremist Islamists because he played a role in negotiating and bringing peace, and it didn't appeared justice to the Palestinian cause. So how far is this narrative true? We are talking about imperialistic, and if it is at all, then since we are talking about a two-state solution, and if Egypt plays a role being the border state in the upcoming time, what is the general notion of the people there? Are they fine with the two-state approach? Because in 1977-78 also we were heading to the two-state approach. So how is that fair now?
So, like I said, the peace accords were definitely an important bifurcation in the history that of the two countries of Palestine and Egypt, which to a great extent by and large, was one history of anti-colonial struggle until that moment, basically. Until that moment where not only the peace accords were signed, but Egyptian polity is being radically transformed. Like I said, the military institution is reconfigured to basically support peace and create a state of normalization with the state of Israel. Of course, the assassination of Sadat after the signing of the peace accords, the assassination of the Egyptian Minister of Culture by freedom fighters at different points in time in order to confront this rising normalization between Egypt and Israel are signs that the desire of the freedom, the liberation movement to remind that Israel is the enemy and there can be peace accords. So I mean it is part of the narrative that that at some point both as a product of remaining colonial power and rising post-colonial nation states that are more and more seeing their future not in unison in the face of one Israeli enemy, but more in terms of their own separate rising national projects. So Egypt versus Arab, Egyptian versus Arab, Jordanian versus Arab, and Jordan first, Egypt first. This Egyptianization of national identity is actually what contributed to this possible bifurcation, which is an important part of narrating the story. And like I said, we have to always bring that tension, the dialectical tension between this being an imperial history, but also a history of national liberation. This is our also history of national liberation coming to a halt somehow. And these two histories are coming together in dialectical tensions. Right now, nobody wants to go to war. Nobody thinks we have the resources to go to war. But at the same time, there is a popular sentiment that feels that Israel is aggressing people who are not strangers to us, who are brothers and sisters, who are Arabs. So even though there is a state engineered since the end of the 1970s up until now decline in fostering this Arabness in our identity, it's a popular sentiment that resists this state engineering. I don't come from a Muslim background, but I cannot but think of myself as an Arab by virtue of my education, the language I speak, the education I got, my socialization, and so on. And this is something that stays within the people. Whether it will be able to play a role in resolving the situation, in granting Palestinians a state in this stalemate we're in right now, I don't know. For the most part, I feel there is a lot of powerlessness, but also there is no absolute power on the other hand. Even if you're powerless, I don't see those ruling us as having extreme power to govern over the situation.
How big is the gap between the sentiment and feelings and thinking on the street and official policy under a strongman government? We have one here in India. But are you seeing any kind of convergence or narrowing the gap? This may also apply to some other Arab countries.
So basically, in this particular war, Egypt has taken up a position that resonated on a popular level, which is that basically it refused an Israeli push with also American and in general Western support to support Israel in this war by displacing Palestinians of Gaza to Egypt. And Egypt stood staunchly in that regard against this displacement plan by basically closing its border to Palestinians and saying no Palestinians will come out of Gaza, and we will not support a displacement plan that is being engineered by the US and Israel and their allies. And this is a position that is supported by the people, but it's also important to have nuance in the sense that Egypt is doing this out of its own national security considerations, which is understandable, in the sense that Egypt does not want the conflict exported, let's say, or outsourced to its own lands in the Sinai Peninsula. But at the same time, to what extent does this position show support to Palestinians that are struggling? This is a question mark that I personally have and many others have, and this is also the nuance of the space that there is between what seems to be an alignment on a popular level and authorities, but also some dissident voices. In the sense that I think the situation should not be shifted from being a political situation to a humanitarian situation, in the sense that we just open the border and let Palestinians in, and it becomes a humanitarian displacement on the grounds of a humanitarian crisis. I think injured Palestinians have the right to come and get treatment in Egypt and have the right to return, and Egypt should be in a position to support their return to Gaza and to their lands and to their homes. Now, the lack of political leverage that Egypt has when it comes to returning them to a place that is being reoccupied by Israel as we speak now is, testament to, again, imperial remnants at this point. So
get to the point of 1973 to 1976, which is an important decision point in Egypt's leadership. Anwar Sadat made that decision. So from 1948 to 1973, Egypt was completely backing the Palestinian cause and fought the wars against them. But I suppose post 1967, it was a question of redeeming its honor. 1973 did that. But it also made major changes because 1973 war was fought with exceptional support from the Soviet Union. And then Sadat made the change to switch to the American camp. And does that mean that Egyptians or Egypt as a nation state dropped any involvement with the Palestinian cause by recognizing Israel, and peace was more important and development was more important for Egypt, and therefore you had a hands-off approach to the Palestinian problem?
Exactly, this is what I meant when I said it's a bifurcation, a historical bifurcation that was long in the making, and that was basically proclaimed publicly was the signing of the peace accords in the late 1970s. And the bifurcation could not just happen as a bifurcation on its own. It had to be accompanied with a new political project that is centered on, again, this idea of Egypt first. Peace is good for Egyptians, even if it's not good for Palestinians, but it's good for Egyptians. Economic development is needed. I talked about imperialism and the remnant of imperialism as as a narrative overriding this story, but I did not talk about capitalism also. This is also an important moment for Egypt's economic integration in the global economy that could not have been possible if it did not sign these peace accords. So it's also a story of capitalism, and I think it's just very important to bring these different layers together to understand what is it that we're fighting for. We're not just talking here about a group of people losing the right to statehood or to self-determination or to simply live. If we're talking about the current war where people are being killed en masse, we are also talking about how different forces are coming together to affect not just our region but the entirety of the global order. And this global condition is, has capitalism as an important center of it, the new types of colonialism that are still governing the world. And, whatever is remaining from history, from imperialist history. So yeah,